Memphis in the summer of 1975 was hot and slow the way it always was that time of year. People moved through the city at their own pace. Shops opened late and closed early. The afternoons stretched out long and quiet. On one of those afternoons, a group of cars pulled up outside Madison Cadillac on Elvis Presley Boulevard. The man who stepped out was 40 years old, heavyset compared to how he had looked a decade earlier, and wearing dark sunglasses. Most people in Memphis knew who he was before he reached the door. Elvis Presley had come to buy a car. By the time he left, he had bought 14. The total amount spent that afternoon was somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000, depending on which account you follow. The dealership staff had not seen anything like it. The sales team moved quickly, writing up paperwork as fast as they could while Elvis moved through the showroom pointing at vehicles and telling his people to add them to the list. Some of the cars went to members of his inner circle, the group of friends and employees who had been with him for years and who traveled with him everywhere. These were men who had given a significant part of their lives to working for Elvis, and this was one of the ways he acknowledged that. A car was not just a car when Elvis gave it to you. It was his way of saying he noticed the work you put in. Some of the cars went to other people he knew, associates, staff at Graceland, people who had done him favors or who had simply been around long enough to earn a place on his list that day. And then there was Minnie Person. Minnie Person was a nurse. She was not part of Elvis's circle. She did not work for him. She had no particular connection to him at all. She happened to be at the dealership that afternoon, and at some point she stood near a yellow Cadillac and said something to the effect that it was a beautiful car. Elvis heard her. He walked over, asked her a few questions, and then told the salesman to put the yellow Cadillac on his bill. Minnie Person left Madison Cadillac that afternoon with a car she did not own when she arrived. She had not asked for it. She had not expected it. She simply said the wrong thing, or the right thing, depending on how you look at it, within earshot of a man who had a habit of responding to admiration with ownership transfer. Word spread through the dealership fast. The staff kept working, kept writing up paperwork, but people were paying attention to what was happening. A crowd began to form outside on the street. People passing by slowed down when they saw the activity through the windows. By the time the afternoon was winding down, there were people gathered on the sidewalk outside just to watch. This was Memphis. People knew Elvis. They had grown up watching him become famous while living in the same city. He was not a distant figure to them. He was someone who still showed up in their neighborhoods, who still used the same streets, who was still, in some ways, one of them. Seeing him inside a car dealership buying vehicles for strangers was unusual even by his standards, but it was also somehow not surprising. The story moved through the city that evening. People called friends. Friends called other friends. By the next morning, most of Memphis had heard some version of what happened at Madison Cadillac that day before. The dealership itself would talk about that afternoon for years. It became one of those stories that gets passed down, from the salesmen who were there to their families, from the staff to people who came in later and asked about the framed photographs on the wall. 14 cars. One afternoon, one man with a checkbook and a way of seeing generosity not as something that needed to be planned or measured, but as something that happened naturally when the moment called for it. There was no press release issued that day, no photographer had been called ahead of time, no one was managing the story or thinking about how it would look. Elvis simply showed up at a car dealership, started buying, and did not stop until he was finished. What drove him to do it, and what he did that same evening with one of the cars he kept for himself, is where the real story begins. To understand why Elvis spent $250,000 in cars in a single afternoon and gave several of them away to people without a second thought, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the fame, not to the music. To a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, where a boy grew up watching his parents worry about money every single day. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935. His parents, Vernon and Gladys Presley, were young and had very little. Vernon had built the house they lived in himself, using lumber bought on credit. It was a small structure, 2 rooms, no indoor plumbing, no insulation against the Mississippi heat or cold. By the standards of the time and place, it was not unusual. Many families in that part of Tupelo lived the same way. But that did not make it easy. Vernon struggled to find steady work. He took whatever jobs were available: farm labor, odd work, anything that paid. There were stretches when money was extremely tight, when the family had to make decisions about what they could and could not afford. Food was sometimes scarce. Clothing was bought secondhand or made at home. Elvis sewed many of Elvis's clothes herself. Elvis was an only child. His twin brother, Jesse Garin, was stillborn on the same day Elvis was born. Gladys never fully recovered from that loss, and she poured everything she had into Elvis. The two of them were extremely close throughout her life. People who knew the family said Gladys treated Elvis with an intensity that went beyond normal parenting. She had lost one son. She was not going to lose the other. Growing up in that environment, Elvis absorbed 2 things that stayed with him forever. The first was an understanding of what it felt like to not have enough. He knew what real poverty looked like from the inside. He knew what it meant to want something basic and not be able to have it. That knowledge did not leave him when the money came. It sat with him quietly and shaped the way he thought about what he owned and what other people did not. The second thing he absorbed was his mother's generosity. Gladys Presley, despite having very little, was known among the people who knew her as someone who gave freely. If a neighbor needed something, she helped if she could. If someone was struggling, she did not look away. Elvis watched that his entire childhood. It became his baseline understanding of how a person was supposed to behave toward others. When Elvis became famous, and the speed at which it happened was remarkable, going from a regional curiosity to a national phenomenon in the space of about a year between 1955 and 1956, the money came fast and in amounts he had no framework for. He had never seen that kind of wealth up close. Nobody in his family had. Nobody in his neighborhood had. His response was not to hold on to it carefully. His response was to give it away. The cars started early. By the late 1950s, Elvis was already known for buying vehicles and handing them to people in his circle. As the years went on and the money kept coming, the scale grew. He bought cars for band members, for backup singers, for the men who traveled with him and handled logistics. He bought cars for family members. He bought cars for people he had just met. The Memphis Mafia, the group of friends and employees who surrounded Elvis through most of his adult life, received more cars than most of them could easily count. Some of them received multiple vehicles over the years. It was understood within that group that if Elvis walked into a dealership, you might walk out with something. But it was not only the people close to him. Elvis gave cars to strangers regularly. The Minnie Person episode at Madison Cadillac in 1975 was one of the most talked about examples, but it was far from the only one. There are documented accounts going back years of Elvis buying vehicles for people he had no prior relationship with, simply because something in the moment moved him to do it. By 1975, the people around him had genuinely stopped being surprised. Joe Esposito, who managed Elvis's road operations for years, later said that trying to stop Elvis from giving things away was pointless. It was not impulsive behavior in the way that word usually suggests something reckless. It was consistent. It was considered in its own way. It was simply who he was. A man who remembered having nothing and who never found a way to feel settled about having everything. 14 cars had been purchased that afternoon. The paperwork was done. The dealership staff were still processing what they had just witnessed. The crowd outside had thinned, but not completely gone. It had been a long afternoon, and by any measure, the day was already complete. But Elvis was not finished. Among the 14 vehicles bought that day, one had been set aside for Elvis himself. It was a 1975 Cadillac Eldorado. White exterior, dark interior, brand new off the floor. It was a large, well-built car, the kind of vehicle that suited the way Elvis moved through the world at that point in his life. Solid, comfortable, built to cover distance without drawing attention to the effort. Elvis had driven to Graceland that evening, and then, sometime after dark, he got behind the wheel and took it out himself. This was not something he did often by 1975. The years of constant touring and late nights had taken a physical toll. His health had been declining for some time. He was heavier than he had been in his prime years, and the combination of prescription medications he was taking affected his energy and his routines. Most evenings at Graceland followed a predictable pattern. Late nights inside the house, movies, food, time with whoever happened to be staying there. Getting into a car alone and driving through Memphis was a departure from that pattern. People who were at Graceland that evening later recalled that Elvis seemed settled in his mood after returning from the dealership. Not excited the way someone might be after an unusual afternoon, but calm. The kind of calm that comes when a person has done something that felt right to them and is not looking for anyone to confirm it. He did not take a large group with him. Accounts vary slightly on exactly who was present, but the consistent detail across multiple sources is that this was not a convoy. It was Elvis in a new car, moving through the city with minimal company. Memphis at night in the summer of 1975 was its own kind of place. The heat stayed in the air after dark. The streets in certain parts of town stayed active late. Elvis had grown up in this city, or close enough to it that he knew its rhythms. He had driven these streets before fame, during fame, and through all the years in between. The city knew him, and in some quiet way, he still knew the city back. At some point during that drive, Elvis stopped at a gas station. The accounts of what happened next come from people who were either present or heard it directly from those who were. A small group of people recognized him almost immediately. In Memphis in 1975, this was not a surprise. What was slightly surprising was what Elvis did next. He stayed. He did not sign a few autographs and move on. He did not acknowledge people briefly and get back in the car. He stood outside that gas station and talked with the people who had gathered for close to an hour. Regular people. People who lived in that part of the city, who had stopped for gas or happened to be nearby, and who found themselves having a conversation with one of the most famous men in the world as if it were the most ordinary thing. There were no photographers. No one from his management team was coordinating the moment. It was not part of any public appearance or a scheduled event. It was simply Elvis talking to people in Memphis on a summer night because he wanted to. Joe Esposito and others who were close to Elvis during this period spoke later about moments like this one. They described a version of Elvis that the public rarely saw. Not the performer, not the celebrity, but a man who was most comfortable when the performance was not required, when he could just be a person talking to other people without anything at stake. Charlie Hodge, one of Elvis's closest friends and a constant presence in his life from the late 1950s onward, said that Elvis genuinely liked people in a straightforward way. Not in the way that famous people sometimes say they like people as a way of explaining their public behavior. He meant it in a simpler sense. Elvis was curious about people. He liked hearing about their lives. He liked the back and forth of a real conversation. The gas station stop that night was a small moment. It did not make the news. It did not become a story until years later when the people who were there talked about it. But it captured something true about who Elvis was underneath everything else. The afternoon at Madison Cadillac and the quiet drive through Memphis that followed were not isolated events. They were a window into a man who, by 1975, was carrying the full weight of everything his life had become. The fame, the money, the expectations, the health problems, and underneath all of it, the memory of where he had started. Elvis was 40 years old that summer. To the people who had followed his career from the beginning, that number carried some weight. He had been famous since he was 21. Nearly half his life had been lived in public, under conditions that very few people had ever experienced before him, and that he had no real guide for navigating. The industry in the 1950s had no established blueprint for what happened to someone who became as famous as Elvis as quickly as he did. There were no managers with a long track record of handling that level of celebrity. There were no systems in place to protect the young man from the financial and personal pressures that came with sudden, enormous success. Elvis largely figured it out as he went, with the help of Colonel Tom Parker, whose guidance shaped Elvis's career in significant ways, but also came with its own set of limitations and complications. By 1975, Elvis had been performing in Las Vegas for 6 years. The residency at the International Hotel, which later became the Hilton, had started in 1969 and had been a commercial success. But the schedule was relentless. He performed multiple shows a night, multiple nights a week, for weeks at a time, and then went back out on the road for touring. The pace had been punishing for years. His health had been declining visibly. People close to him noticed it. Audiences noticed it. The press noticed it. He had gained a significant amount of weight. He was dealing with several medical conditions, including problems with his colon and his liver. The prescription medications he was taking, managed primarily by his personal physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, had become a serious concern among people in his circle who understood the full picture of what he was consuming. But Elvis kept working. He kept performing. He kept showing up. And he kept giving things away. The pattern of generosity that defined the Madison Cadillac afternoon was, in many ways, one of the most consistent things about Elvis across his entire adult life. From the moment the money started coming in, he had used it to give. Cars were the most visible example, but they were far from the only one. He paid medical bills for people he barely knew. He covered funeral costs for families who could not afford them. He gave cash to strangers in amounts that most people would have considered significant. He bought jewelry, instruments, and equipment for musicians he admired. Graceland itself was an expression of this. He had bought the estate in 1957 and had maintained it as a home, not just for himself, but for his family and the extended group of people who were part of his daily life. At any given time, Graceland housed a rotating collection of friends, employees, and family members. The costs of running the property, feeding everyone, maintaining the vehicles and the grounds were substantial. Elvis paid all of it without complaint. What the day at Madison Cadillac said about his life was not complicated. It said that the boy from Tupelo, who had grown up watching his mother make do with almost nothing, had become a man who could not hold on to things when other people did not have them. The money was real, the generosity was real, and the two were connected in a way that went back to the very beginning of his life. The last 2 years of Elvis's life, from the summer of 1975 to his death in August 1977, would see his health continue to decline. The tours continued. The performances became more uneven. People who loved him watched with concern, and in some cases with a feeling of helplessness that they could not do more. He died at Graceland on August 16, 1977. He was 42 years old. What he left behind was not just the music, though the music was extraordinary and has outlasted nearly anything from its era. What he left behind was also a long record of how he had treated people when no one was watching. The cars, the cash, the quiet conversations at gas stations in Memphis on summer nights. A man who remembered having nothing and spent the rest of his life making sure the people around him had something. That was the real story of that afternoon in 1975. And it was the real story of Elvis Presley.